Welcome to Grab Your Gear. I am Joe. Welcome to our show this week. And of course, joining me as he does every week, Jack Windsor. Jack, of course, from the Windsor Report on 98.9 on radio in Central Ohio, but also of the Ohio Press Network, a publication of which, my friend, you founded, you edit, you star in, you contribute, you run.
The whole 9 yards. We do it all. I do it all, and our team is fantastic, and we have great syndication partners. So make sure you check out the Ohio Press Network at theohiopressnetwork.com.
Okay, we will. And a lot going on, but we are kind of starting to wind down. We have our schedule. We are going to be doing just to give a heads up, a very special Christmas Eve edition of Grab Your Gear, which I am looking forward to. And of course, we have our Grab Your Gear office party, which we will not announce the location because last year when we had it, a lot of people crashed it and the bar bill went out of control. And then we will have our New Year's show, which is really something to think about, your top 10 stories of 2024, something I've already started to think about. So that's kind of the rundown for the rest of the month because, as you know, Jack, people are starting to get ready for the holiday. It's 2 weeks away, Christmas, roughly.
Yeah, that's hard to believe. You know, the election cycle was so fast and so full and so furious that uh, November came, and now all of a sudden we're knocking on the door of Christmas. So here we are. But this is a great time of year. We look back and plan ahead. I know a lot of our listeners are probably doing the same thing at work with their businesses and their families. So hopefully everyone gets an opportunity though to slow down for a little bit, enjoy the fruits of their labor, and plan for a prosperous 2025.
Yeah. One thing I've noticed that one group of people who have not slowed down is, of course, President Trump and his nominations. It's interesting to me how quickly he is looking to fill things, how over the weekend he was in Paris, how he's almost like the president now, even though he doesn't officially become president until the 20th. Um, I was going to ask you about it. Does this seem kind of odd because he actually is acting like the president right now? I mean, you see him in Paris. Uh, the nomination, people are talking to him. He did an interview in 60 Minutes,
Yeah.
and our President Biden, we just don't hear a lot of.
Yeah, well, Biden's been hiding for a long time, and I think there are a couple of things in play here. Number one, Donald Trump is an aggressive personality, and he's going to hit the ground running. I think that's exacerbated by the fact that, and you and I have talked about this before, the midterm elections will probably take away the majority that Republicans have in the US House. So when you look at the full scope of what he needs to get done and the timeline within which he needs to get those things done, it makes sense that he's hitting the ground running, and because he has a lot to do. And frankly, this is just my personal opinion. Can you imagine going from talking with, negotiating with, partnering with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris to Donald Trump? I think people are excited to have what we would call a leader that they can actually talk with and negotiate with. Certainly not a beta male.
Yeah, it is. At times they are changing. I want to ask you about two questions before I get in. I do want to talk to you about this pardon situation
Mhm.
because it's starting to take on a life of its own. But I want to ask you about a couple of other news stories. Apprentice Isabella actually brought this up to us about the shooter in New York. Of course, the United Healthcare CEO was murdered actually at a hotel, right in front of a hotel on 6th Avenue, which oddly enough, my wife, daughters, and two granddaughters were staying at just a few weeks ago. It is literally the Hilton on 6th Avenue. Directly, it's not directly, but almost directly across from Radio City Music Hall. So, I mean, this is not your typical rundown. Let me put it this way: it's one of the sections of New York that's pretty well patrolled.
Right.
Um, they're still looking for the guy as of we're taping this today. Is there anything that strikes you about that murder that seems? I mean, everybody thought it was a professional hit. Now it's starting to feel a little bit like a movie.
The thing that strikes me about, well, first of all, obviously it was premeditated. The guy
Yeah.
went through the hassle of writing words on bullets that now people are trying to uh, figure out what they mean. There's speculation that he may have been denied a claim because of the types of words that were written on the bullets. But to me, it's a weird combination. And I think you just got to the crux of it. First, there's a silencer on the gun, and it appeared that the execution was carried out according to whatever plan this guy had. And then off he went, and he still hasn't been found. But then there's this sloppy stuff, right? Like, you wrote stuff on bullets, you left a backpack behind. And to me, when you just pump the brakes a little bit and go, okay, we're going to slow down or we're going to stop, and we're just going to look at this from all the possible angles, you go, this guy feels like a patsy. This guy feels like someone that they can build a narrative around. And that's just my gut reaction. That's my hot take. And that certainly can be way, way off. And maybe it is. I don't know. This could have been just one guy who's really pissed off because someone or something went really wrong in his life. And, we live in a world where if you're the CEO of a company and you make millions of dollars a year, people are angry at you. And so a combination of a really bad decision, maybe within that organization, coupled with the fact that this guy makes a ton of money on its own might be enough for somebody to, who's probably seriously mentally unstable to do what he did, but who knows? It could be something deeper.
So I've watched just enough of Tinfoil Ted always gives me a list of like mystery movies and things like that to watch. I'll throw this at you. What if he left the messy trail behind on purpose?
Yeah.
What if it's all on purpose to create an image and a trail that isn't there? So I'll leave you at that.
Yep.
I want to ask you about a law called the Corporate Transparency Act.
Mhm.
And it's something that very few people know about. Let me give you the highlights of it, and then I want to ask you what you think's really going on. It's called the Corporate Transparency Act. Some people just call it the CTA. It technically went into effect January 1st, 2024, so a year ago, technically. So many US small businesses are required to file what they call a transparency report with basically explaining who the owners are. And this only really applies to companies under 20 people or under $5 million in gross revenues. That's like barbershops, small mom and pop dry cleaners, things like that. Now, these businesses would need to submit, though, the full names, date of birth, home address, and a picture ID of what would be the beneficial owners. So if you own an LLC with your wife, you too would have to file this information if you had less than 5 employees and less than $5 million. Now, proponents say the bill is to track down criminals who create shell companies to launder money, such as Hunter Biden. And it's a self reporting law, which means the odds are real criminals simply aren't going to comply with the law, or they'll just put false information on their taxes or on these forms, like Hunter Biden. So most businesses, um, are coming up that they have to file this on January 1st, 2025, and failure to file is where I found this pretty amazing. It's like a $500 a day plus $10,000 fine. It's basically $591 a day plus $10,000 if you do not file. I'm talking small businesses here. Uh, to give you before I get your feedback on what you think this really is, a federal court in Alabama has ruled that it's unconstitutional. It will be reviewed by the 11th Circuit at the end of the month. 11th Circuit is in Atlanta. So, Jack, this is really odd because if you're going to track down shell companies, this doesn't feel like how you do it. This feels like an invasion of privacy, just to be candid.
It certainly does. To me, it comes down to the supply and demand of government regulation. And, if you're in the taxi cab business or you're in the utility business,
Mhm.
sometimes those companies actually want government regulation because they can artificially inflate their costs and tell the government that, hey, bottom line is we need to be making this. And then they really create kind of a duopoly or a monopoly, and they shelter their companies. They really create sheltered cash flow. But when you look at this, you go, okay, who's demanding this regulation? It certainly isn't. And by the way, I'll say it because you already said that I'm, founder of the Ohio Press Network. I wouldn't necessarily want to say this publicly, but yeah, my wife and I do have LLCs, and we had this discussion. And I won't tell you what I told her when she said, "Hey, we've got to get this filed." I said, "Yeah, let me tell you where they can file that." But the bottom line is, we don't small businesses, right? Small business administration, uh, individual business owners, they don't want this regulation because now we have to consult with an attorney. Now we have to
Yeah.
check with the accountant. Now we have to, and so who's demanding this? Well, the government. Well, what parts of the government? I would submit to you that the same Obama, Biden, Clinton acolytes who wanted to crack down. Do you remember what the IRS did
Yeah.
to nonprofit organizations?
Yeah.
This is that in the private sector. That is all I can I mean, that's the only way I can justify this. Who the hell wants everybody's, by the way, we want photo IDs for businesses. Hell, they don't even want photo IDs to vote. It's
Yeah.
crazy.
Can I give you a homework assignment for next week?
Please.
One of the people who's openly been against this since the start is Warren Davidson. He is a congressman from Ohio, and I believe you know him.
Yes,
Would
I
you be
do.
able to track him down and maybe let us know what his thoughts are on this thing?
Yeah,
Because
maybe we could even get him on the podcast next week, or I could get him on the show again this week and upload some of the audio and video clips to you.
I'm curious because here's where my mind goes. Didn't they hire like 70,000 or 100,000 IRS agents? And then, yeah, I kind of wonder if this is basically to make it a little easier to go after small businesses, which who
Absolutely.
can't afford. Look, I once talked to an accountant one time, and he said he really believes that they calculate what an audit would cost a small business. They send an amount of money that's just over what they believe it would do to them and collect. He was just thought that way. He thought that this was a contrived thing. This feels like an invasion of privacy plus a path to audit, or to prevent an audit, you just pay whatever they think you owe. And
Yeah,
I don't,
it's disgusting because, it really it's just another tooth in the gears, right? That kind of grabs you and winds you up under the government where you get crushed. But to me, I have a friend who owns multiple businesses, and there's two problems. One, the government thinks that they have the authority to do this. Two, we have an IRS that is ass backwards. Uh, American jurisprudence says that you're innocent until proven guilty. With the IRS, you're guilty until you can prove that you're innocent. And I have a friend who has multiple companies, has done really well, and the IRS reached out to him one day and said, "Hey, you underpaid your taxes in this year. Prove to us that you didn't." And he's like, And then all of a sudden, it's the amount that was owed, it's the penalty, right? And the penalty starts from the time that you didn't pay it and it rolls up. And then all of a sudden you're 15, 20, $30,000 in arrears to the IRS. Look, that can cripple a small business. And I mean, to me, this is disgusting. This is the kind of stuff that the Donald Trump administration and future administrations need to take a look at, because the government can't even pay its own damn bills. $35 trillion in debt, deficit spending at $2 trillion a year. And you're going to come in and try to regulate me as a small business owner? Get the hell out of here.
All right, so you have your homework assignment. You're going to get a hold of Congressman Davidson, and you're going to find out what's behind this. And of course, we'll watch it. Like I said, technically, it is in the 11th Circuit. We may have an answer before Christmas that it's unconstitutional, but it is a scary thing because you know how many business owners don't even know this exists, and they could be charged $591 a day plus 10,000 bucks.
Or 2 years in prison if you get, I mean, if you get before the wrong magistrate or judge on this, right? If you're red elephant consulting, you might be screwed.
Let's hope that this is something the Trump administration gets ahead of. Now, as we kind of wrap up the show, I did want to ask you about this Hunter Biden pardon, not necessarily his pardon, but this attempted, well, okay, this discussion of a blanket pardon. And I want to tell you what I think, and then I want to know what you think. But the pardons, okay, so he pardons Hunter Biden for crimes he may have or may not have committed, who knows, for a
Mhm.
decade, right? So he gets a pardon on the two cases that he was before, the gun charge and the tax charge. But then he gets pardoned for things that may have happened. I'm not even sure if you can do that, but apparently you can. And then you get this article in Politico, which felt a lot like a trial balloon, where they're talking about pardons that center on people like Liz Cheney, Adam Schiff, and our friend Dr. Fauci. Again, not saying they're being pardoned for a specific crime, but things they may have done. So my mind goes to COVID and goes to the Russian collusion stuff that was later, you know, I don't know if debunked is the wrong term, but there was the investigation that basically said that this was a false narrative. But according to Politico, there's an internal debate among staff members, not necessarily the president, but his staff. So he's not even in the meeting on floating out these pardons. The only other thing I would say before I get your feedback on it, the message is Donald Trump is so evil that they have to do this, right? So they always preface everything by saying, we can't trust Donald Trump, so we have to do this. It's kind of ingenious. They keep Trump as the villain even after he's won the
Mhm.
election, even after he's won, the majority of the votes of the American people, that's the reason why they do it. Um, the other thing I want you to watch is how many lower tier staffers end up working at like Raytheon for $700,000 a year or something ungodly. And to me, they're talking about all these people that have to take these jobs. But the minute you see a 27-year-old that was like a third tier staffer at the State Department get a big job, that means in my brain, they're paying people to keep quiet. All of it to me, and I think this way, Jack, it just feels like this is a pre-bunking cover-up, and
Mhm.
I can't help but think that way. What are
Well,
your
look, nothing in politics happens on accident, and you have to look at who is pushing the narrative. And first of all, isn't it interesting that we're still talking about January 6th? We're still talking about Russia collusion. And the reality is, Donald Trump made a phone call to find out about the Biden crime syndicate, which is the Biden crime syndicate. And so what he was calling about has been proven to be true. If that wasn't true, we wouldn't need this blanket pardon. It would have been, well, I pardon Hunter for the gun charge. I pardon Hunter for the tax evasion. This is a decade long blanket pardon. And Apprentice Isabella, I think, was talking earlier today about what is the spirit of this, right? Certainly, a president has the authority to pardon, but what
Yeah.
is the spirit of the pardon? Is it to keep a check and balance between the executive branch and the judiciary? And if a court made a wrong decision or maybe interpreted legal precedent incorrectly, that the chief executive could say, hey, in this instance, I'm going to pardon you. This has turned into a get out of jail free card. I'm not quite sure that that's what pardons were intended to do. And going back to what I said about look at who is floating the balloon. I mean, we're going to talk about this in 2025 because we're going to get behind the curtain and we're going to let people see the matrix. But what is going on here is the left who sucks at creating policies that work because their policies always slouch towards socialism and communism and death and destruction. What they have to do is they have to bastardize and half truth and villainize people in order to drum up enough emotion to get their ideas across the finish line. So we should not be surprised that they're using Orange Man Bad as the reason to do something that I don't even think the Constitution allows a president to do in the spirit of that constitutional provision.
It does feel though a little bit like the American people are kind of on to the everything Trump evil, whatever. It does feel like that narrative has become so tired. I'm not sure people hear it anymore because two things. One, I think they're tired of the narrative, and two, I'm not sure they believe the people who pushing the narrative as much as they used to. The
No,
media.
I don't think they do either. In fact, I've got to use a second to talk about this. Cleveland.com online version of the Plain Dealer. I grew up a Browns fan, and so
Mhm.
an Indians fan. I used to read that paper a lot for sports back in the day. It has become a left leaning rag. They've adopted the New York Times business model, which is we're going to promote the propaganda of the progressive movement and even the extreme stuff. And we're just going to go forward with that, realizing that we have a certain segment of people that will read, and they certainly still get people that read their sports. And then people like me who just try to figure out what kind of propaganda are they pushing. But their editor in chief wrote an editorial over the weekend that found its way into my inbox. And apparently, there are a lot of people that read the Cleveland Plain Dealer and Cleveland.com, who are saying to the editor, your election coverage sucked. It was skewed. It wasn't fair. And of course, he's in defense mode saying, oh my goodness, our election coverage on the presidential election, Sherrod Brown versus Bernie Moreno, Ohio issue 1 was fair. I mean, the guy's got to be smoking Hunter Biden's crack because they're anything but fair and balanced. But I say all of that to say this. I think you're right. I think even here in the Buckeye State, when we take a look at that, just that small, tiny example, people are going, yeah, I don't really trust you. You're biased. You're pushing a narrative. And so, we're in this predicament where people have the lowest level of trust in mainstream outlets, and they have the lowest level of trust in the government. So, what's going to fill that vacuum? What's going to fill that void? That's why I think what we're doing and what people like President Trump and his movement are doing is going to be so crucial and critical over the next 18 to 24 months.
I mean, what we're doing here with Grab Your Gear is for people to get up and go to work every day, just trying to give them information. And the reason this whole network started a year ago was because of the people who were in the construction and trades said they were concerned that none of their people that worked for them actually got real news, and
Yep.
they were concerned about just them being citizens. Um, but just your Cleveland, and I don't mean to be a jerk here, but I don't know anybody that gets their news from like the Cleveland Plain Dealer or a newspaper anymore.
Well, I'm on record, and I've already swallowed this pill, so I might as well own it. And if it gets too bad, I'll call poison control. But I've already said publicly they had 2 really good writers there, and one of them hit the road already, and the other guy wants to get together and grab a beer soon. So we'll see how he's doing. But it's a shame. They have been given so much responsibility, and they've been given so much privilege and power. I mean, that was handed to them. That was a legacy outlet, and it actually is a little bit heartbreaking. What I would do, and I guess I shouldn't say that because we do have millions of people who consume our content. But what I would do to have the starting, they come out of the blocks 50 yards ahead of me in a 100-yard sprint, man. I'd love to have the resources and longevity that they've had, and they're just pissing it down their legs.
But do you think they really have the resources anymore? I mean, everything I've seen in the newspaper and the dailies is, I mean, they aren't
If you
hiring.
if
They
you
aren't
if you
hiring.
read Chris Quinn, the editor in chief, if you read his editorial, he says, "Oh, we're in the best financial position we've ever been." Now, is that because they went from certain number of reporters and they drastically cut it and they've narrowed where they're at? And by the way, it does probably cost less to produce things digitally. They probably print
Sure.
fewer paper newspapers. So I guess when you look at margins and whatever, but the question is, do you have a product that is attractive and viable? I mean, if I'm making $100 and my margin is $50, I can brag about having a 50% profit margin, but you can't live on $100. So, and to pretend like he's a purveyor of truth would be foolish. So, I don't know how well Cleveland.com is doing. I don't know how well the Columbus Dispatch is doing, but I can tell you when I read the headlines, I go, man, oh man, Shevitz. I mean, they just continue to peddle these propaganda pieces and pass them off as news.
Well, I think we will know where the Cleveland Plain Dealer and papers like that will go once we see where uh, newspapers like the Washington Post and the LA Times go, because they have started to become realist. And if you read anything from the Washington Post, the editor there called his team together and he said, nobody's reading what you're writing. And he said, we can't do this anymore. And that's Jeff Bezos's paper. And he can
Well,
fund anything.
yeah, he can fund anything. There's this really interesting, and this is too far in the weeds, but I want to throw it out there because we can talk about it later. But there's this really interesting ecosystem though in the news business where the progressives, and by the way, isn't it funny the left hates billionaires unless your last name is Soros or Wiss or Gates, but these folks put a lot of money in these non-government organizations that give grants to news outlets. So sometimes when there's not a strong subscription base, they get propped up by these billionaires who just continue to fund the production of their news. So yeah, I don't know. I just know that if I'm looking at an average man test, the average man doesn't pick up a newspaper anymore. And the average man doesn't believe what he reads on the headlines. And so that for me spells opportunity, but it
Yeah.
also spells great responsibility if we're going to keep this country free and great.
Okay, last thing before we take off today, I want to ask you real quick. Ohio Press Network, you did an interview with the Ohio Lieutenant Governor,
Yeah.
John Husted. You did a one-on-one with him, and I think you're going to in next year start actually a segment where you're going to do one-on-one interviews, kind of long form thing
Yeah.
as a feature, which hopefully Grab Your Gear will help you produce. Um, you go away. Okay, the reason I bring that up, even if you're not from Ohio, he's a lieutenant governor, may run for governor. There's an open Senate seat. What did you take away briefly from that interview? And if people want to catch it, they can go to your website, right? The Ohio Press
Yeah. Go to
Network.com. But I mean, Ohio's kind of an interesting place because the vice president now leaves an open Senate seat. It's going to be a governor's race. What did you take away from talking to the lieutenant governor?
Well, I wanted to ask him questions that our listeners to the Windsor Report ask and readers of the Ohio Press Network ask. And so I asked him, like, what are your priorities yet in 2025? Because in 2026, let's face it, he's likely going to be looking at running for governor. Well, maybe asterisks there. We'll talk about that in just a second. But his priorities are economic development and cutting bloat. So he actually they have a neat tool. I realized they were doing this a couple of years ago. They have artificial intelligence that is combing through the Ohio Administrative Code and the Ohio Revised Code and finding things that are superfluous and then acting when they can to cut those things. Because when you really narrow down the rules and regulations that you have to play by, that helps. That helps you cut staff. It helps you, get things done quicker and more efficiently. So there's that. And then he talked about economic development, and so that led into my other question: is the Intel
Yeah.
project in Ohio in trouble? That's something that we've been all over. And, he gave me the political answer, which was, hey, the Biden administration released this funding. We expect this to move forward now. But when I start crunching the numbers, I see that Intel lost $16.6 billion in just the third quarter of 2024. And they got $7.8 billion from the Biden Harris administration that was codified through the CHIPS Act. And then you go, well, that's for Ohio, that's for uh, New Mexico, that's for Oregon. So they have all these projects. I'm still not confident that Intel is going to go off the way that people expected, but I think he's probably going to try to make sure that happens. And then the other key question was, are you going to be the guy that Governor DeWine appoints to the U.S. Senate, or are you going to run for governor? Now, he said to me his plan is to run for governor, but if sources tell me that want to be kept off the record that are deeply in the know, Mike DeWine wants to appoint a woman in that seat. She would be the first female U.S. senator from the Buckeye State. But if he appoints a guy, that John Husted is the guy that will get it if he wants it.
We'll talk about it another time, but I think when people say I want to be the first one to, put a woman or, whatever in, I always go back to just put the best person in because eventually it's going to be a woman or whatever. I mean, just you're eventually going to have the best people are going to be, of all kinds of backgrounds. That kind of drives me crazy.
It's identity politics, and I think it's horseshit. And I think you make a decision based on the
Yeah.
person's history and how they can. This race, this person, this appointment, they have to be able to raise money to run in 26 and win again in 28. Jane Timken is the front runner. If you're asking me today, is it going to be Mike Carey, Jane Timken, whomever? I think Jane Timken is in the
And
pole
just so
position.
people know, who is Jane Timken?
Jane Timken is she married into the Timken family, which is Timken Bearings in Akron, Canton area. Very prolific family, longtime donors to the Republican Party. Jane Timken is former chairwoman of the Ohio Republican Party. She was actually handpicked by President Trump to oust a guy who is now serving a prison term, who was formerly in charge of the Ohio Republican Party. She did that, raised a lot of money for the party. And then she is now the committee woman to the Republican National Committee from Ohio. And she's tightly connected with Bob Paduchik. Bob Paduchik is a former Trump operative and worked with his campaign in 2016 and 2020. And Paduchik is taking a lot of credit for helping defeat issue one in Ohio. So he has a lot of political capital right now. And I know that he's pushing Donald Trump to maybe weigh in on behalf of Jane Timken and make a call to Mike DeWine and say, hey, we'd really like to have Jane Timken in the U.S. Senate. And Mike DeWine, for whatever reason, it's the rhino in him. He's really caught up in identities and doing things that feel good and that kind of feed that persona that he's just this benevolent grandpa that looks out for women and children. Hey, Mike, why don't you make a decision based on talent and ability?
Yeah, why don't you pay more attention to Springfield, Ohio? But that's another show. Okay, so that is our show for today. Jack, I appreciate it. I want to tease in 2 weeks our annual first ever Christmas Eve show, which will be on the 24th. We will have that show for you. We're working the holidays just so we can make everybody's life better.
So you
So,
can enjoy the holidays.
yeah, that's right. So I want to let people know that that is coming up. We'll have some special stuff, like we said, as we wind the year down and get ready to go into 2025. We'll also be working on some programming. You and I have some ideas that we're going to launch that will be kind of a thing between the Ohio Press Network and Grab Your Gear Network. We'll help produce it with each other because information is something we want to make sure people get. We want to make sure they get accurate information. So, Jack, thank you. Have a great rest of your week. We'll check in with you next week. And in the meantime, I am Joe here on the Grab Your Gear Network. I want to thank you for listening to our podcast today. Thanks for Apprentice Isabella for producing the show. And as always, have a great week, everybody. And we will see you back here next week on Grab Your Gear.